Chapter 4, Native Americans. Current Issues Update. Kennewick Man. Approximately 9,400 years ago, a 38 to 45-year-old, 5 foot, 9 inches man died of unknown causes. This man was ceremoniously buried along the southern bank of the mighty Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. In 1996, the nearly complete skeletal remains of Kennewick Man were transferred to the Thomas Burke Museum at the University of Washington. During the past decade, a team of the most prominent archaeologists, anthropologists, and forensic experts from the United States have been trying to establish more information about Kennewick Man's life. One key consideration is his dietary habits. Experts suspect his ancestors may have come from Japan rather than from Central Asia or Siberia. Another unique aspect is whether he or his ancestors came by boats along the Pacific coastline. If these questions are substantiated, then multiple routes were used by a diverse group of humans. Hopefully, extensive future study will clarify more unknowns about the early immigrants to the Pacific Northwest. Native Americans, keys to understanding. Archaeological sites. Locations where Native American remains and artifacts have been found. Kennewick, East Wenatchee, Sequim, Snake River, Marmosman, and Ozigdig. Coastal Indians. Tribes living west of the Cascade Mountains in Oregon and Washington. Necessities of life readily available. Movement by water, isolated due to forest. Kennewick Man. Remains of man buried some 9,400 years ago along the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. Presently located at the University of Washington's Thomas Burke Museum. Nomadism. Common among the Pacific Northwest Plateau Indians, frequently moving for grazing areas, food, water, and security. Plateau Indians. Nomadic tribes living east of the Cascade Mountains, hunter and food gatherers living in the semi-arid climatic region. Potlatch. Coastal Indian ceremony in which host of the potlatch gives away wealth to guests, a visible symbol of wealth. Salmon. Most important food source for all coastal and plateau tribes living in the Pacific Northwest. Salmon return to original site to spawn. Shaman. Spiritual leader and healthcare provider to tribe members, challenging and potentially dangerous position within the tribal unit. Overview. The Pacific Northwest Native Americans made major contributions to the region's cultural history. Arriving from Central Asia, the Native Americans spread across the Western Hemisphere. The Pacific Northwest tribes were culturally and geographically divided into the coastal and plateau groups. Coastal Indians lived in permanent villages along rivers, streams, and ocean waterways. On the other hand, Plateau Indians were nomadic tribes living in the semi-arid interior of the Pacific Northwest region. The Pacific Northwest Native American lifestyle changed forever with the arrival of explorers and later settlers. In 1846, the United States government established a reservation system for all Native Americans. Reservations are specifically set aside for the Native Americans. The reservation system and the mixing of two different cultural groups, Native American and settlers, caused some serious differences of opinion. Natural environment. Before any human inhabitation of the Pacific Northwest, the region's overall climate was much colder than the moderate climatic conditions existing today. Long, very cold winters with heavy snowfall dominated short, cool summers. During the colder periods of each Pleistocene ice age, huge continental glaciers moved southward towards the equator. Conversely, during the warming periods, these continental glaciers receded northward toward the polar region. During cyclical colder and warmer periods, the glacial ice and floodwaters eroded and dramatically altered the physical environment and landscape of the Pacific Northwest. Both existing wildlife and human inhabitants were either destroyed or certainly displaced as a direct result. The combination of massive continental glaciers and numerous alpine glaciers deeply eroded and scarred the physical landscape. The region's physical environment was heavily vegetated with dense evergreen forests and covered by marshlands, lakes, and rivers. The region's major landforms were being created and destroyed by both volcanic and glacial activities. Volcanic activity greatly impacted the Cascade Mountains and the vast interior Columbia Plateau. Glaciation eroded and scored the northern landscape of the entire region. Certainly the results must have caused a most foreboding environment for subsequent human inhabitation. The region's hostile environment presented a very difficult and dangerous situation for each Native American. How did these earliest human immigrants survive? We know that some did, but survival obviously came with great difficulty and many challenges. Basic questions. Several fundamental questions need to be addressed about these original inhabitants. Who were these people that moved into the North American continent and eventually to the Pacific Northwest? When did they arrive? Where did they come from? Why did these early immigrants risk their lives to start a new life in the Western Hemisphere or the New World? How did they cross the vast Pacific and Atlantic Oceans? Original inhabitants. Native Americans were the first humans to move into the Pacific Northwest. Modern-day archaeologists and anthropologists suggest they may have migrated about 30,000 years ago. Some suggest that Native Americans first arrived in North America about 50,000 years ago. It is generally accepted that these early Native Americans originally came from Central Asia and they probably lived here for at least 14,000 years. They most likely walked and or canoed south from present-day Alaska. Migrational hypotheses. Currently, there are 8 migrational hypotheses concerning the route and means of transportation these original settlers of the Western Hemisphere and Pacific Northwest may have used. These possibilities include 1, ice bridge, 2, land bridge, 3, continental shelf, 4, Kon-Tiki, 5, Ra, 6, continental drift, 7, Atlantis, and 8, Mu. 3 existing hypotheses suggest that Native Americans simply walked across the Bering Strait that separates Asia and North America. During the Ice Age, thick continental glaciers covered the Bering Strait. Thus, early travelers could have easily crossed from present-day Siberia, Asia, to Alaska, North America, across the sea. During an ice age, a much colder climate reduces snow and ice melt. Therefore, less water runs off the landscape into the oceans, leaving more land surface exposed. As a result, the level of the Pacific Ocean may have been at least 300 feet lower than its present level. This would allow humans to walk across the exposed continental shelf or to cross a land bridge to Alaska. Thor Heyerdahl, a late 20th century Norwegian explorer and adventurer, proved the feasibility of successfully crossing large water bodies in very primitive sailing vessels. Heyerdahl's primitive balsa raft, the Kon-Tiki, crossed the vast Pacific Ocean. Another reed boat named the Ra II crossed the Atlantic Ocean. These difficult and dangerous maritime feats were aided by favorable ocean currents and prevailing wind patterns, plus moderate weather conditions, and of course, good luck and maritime skills. The continental drift hypothesis suggests that the Western Hemisphere, North America and South America, was once much closer to the African and Eurasian landmasses of the Eastern Hemisphere. This suggests that the landmasses of the Earth were once connected or closer together, but over millions of years slowly separated. Thus, the Western Hemisphere probably did not have human passengers because human migration occurred only during the past 50,000 years. The Atlantis and Mu theories suggest that very large islands, Atlantis and Mu, once existed in the middle of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans respectively. If these islands did exist, then early humans could travel to those islands on their journey to the Western Hemisphere. Theoretically, this may have occurred, but there is currently no substantiated evidence that Atlantis or Mu existed. The continental drift, Atlantis, and Mu hypotheses seem to be the least likely explanation of Native American migration to the Western Hemisphere. The most logical explanations for human migration seem to include the land bridge, continental shelf, and ice bridge hypotheses. During the last Pleistocene ice age, humans walked across either land or ice while entering the North American continent. Certainly, Native Americans immigrated to North America and the Pacific Northwest at least 14,000 years before any Europeans, 1542 AD. Reason for migration. Native Americans may have migrated from Central Asia to North America in search of food, a milder climate, a better and safer environment, for adventure, or they may have been driven out by superior, stronger cultures. Regardless of the reason, they crossed into the Western Hemisphere. Even if Native Americans arrived by accident, eventually there was purpose for their migration. Earliest inhabitants. Evidence indicates that the first Native Americans arrived in the Pacific Northwest region between 13,000 and 30,000 years ago. Some of the earliest arriving Native Americans may have come by canoe, but most probably arrived on foot. Where did these earliest Pacific Northwest residents come from? The chance that they came directly from Central Asia to the Pacific Northwest is remote. The vast majority moved from another part of the North American continent into this region. The ancestors of Western Washington and Oregon coastal Indians simply moved southward from Alaska's Panhandle region and the western coastal areas of the Canadian province of British Columbia. Eastern Washington and Oregon, including the entire state of Idaho, were first inhabited by the nomadic Native Americans, Plateau Indians, arriving from the southern interior of Canada and the northern portions of California, Nevada, and Utah. Early Plateau Indians also came west across the Rockies from the Great Plains of the United States and Canada. These Native Americans crossed the continent on foot, although some may have rafted or canoed down the many rivers flowing westward towards the Pacific Ocean. Geologic observations. Arriving at least 14,000 years ago and perhaps some 30,000 years ago, early Pacific Northwest Native Americans lived in a beautiful but violent and harsh natural environment. Facing the unknown and severe personal hardships, these earliest settlers somehow found a way to survive. Native Americans witnessed the evolution of the natural environment in which they lived. Over the past 30,000 years, the Native Americans living in the Pacific Northwest experienced a primitive lifestyle during the latter stages of continental glaciation and volcanic activity. They lived in a stunning natural environment that had both uncommon beauty and a violent, destructive geologic history. Native Americans observed the following: 1, cooling and warming of the Earth's climate; 2, the advancement and retreat of massive continental and alpine glaciers; 3, the damming of the Columbia; and Clark's Fork rivers by the Okanogan and Polson lobes respectively; horrendous glacial floods resulting from the damming of the Columbia River and the bursting of Lake Missoula; 5, the formation of Grand Coulee, dry falls, and the channeled scablands by the multiple glacial floods; 6, the flooding of the Puget Sound by the Pacific Ocean; 7, the construction and destruction of Mount Rainier from an estimated 17,000 feet to a current 14,411 foot elevation; 8, Mount Mazama, once 12,000 foot mountain, became Crater Lake; and the entire geologic history of Mount St. Helens, a non-existent mountain, grew to 9,677 feet then was blown away to an 8,366-foot high horseshoe-shaped crater. Pacific Northwest Native Americans experienced some of the region's most significant geologic events. Legends concerning Indian origins. Even though most present-day scientists believe that Native Americans came from Central Asia thousands of years ago, the Pacific Northwest Indians have their own beliefs about their origin as individuals or as tribal groups. The region's Native Americans passed down legends from one generation to the next through storytelling, chants, and songs. Each tribal group has their own unique explanation of their origin and subsequent struggle to survive. Generally, legends tell of a horrible, invisible monster who destroys everything. A lone, courageous animal slays the monster from within its body. Then the monster's body is cut into small body parts. Each piece of the body represents the creation of a specific neighboring tribe. There is a close identification of the characteristics of the body part with the skills of the tribe. The animal that kills the monster provides the tribe with food, water, shelter, and protection. Each tribal group has their own interpretation. Iltsuetsix. The great sea monster called Iltsuetsix lives in the Kamaya Valley of the Nez Perce tribe. The monster eats everything and ravages all in its path. A coyote is eaten by Iltsuetsix. Once inside, the coyote stabs the heart of the monster, killing him. After escaping, a fox suggests that the coyote cut up the monster. Each part of the monster becomes a tribe. The severed head becomes the Kootenai, or Flathead tribe. The feet become the Blackfoot tribe. The blood from the monster's head creates the Nez Perce. A very important Native American landmark, Kamaya Butte, forms the Iltsuetsix heart is turned into stone. Another Nez Perce legend has the monster living in the Wallowa Hills. A coyote takes burning coals into the monster's stomach. He burns a hole in the stomach to escape. Each drop of blood shed by the monster becomes a Nez Perce Indian. Wishpoosh. Indians living in the Cascade Mountains tell a similar story with a slight variation. Wishpoosh, a beaver monster, lives in Lake Cle Elum. Twice the coyote attempts to kill the beaver monster, first with a spear in a horrible fight. The battle results in the making of several physical features such as river valleys, the Columbia River, and the lakes. Second, the coyote becomes a fir tree that is eaten by Wishpoosh. Once inside, the coyote appears and kills Wishpoosh by knifing its heart. Afterward, the body of Wishpoosh is cut up into smaller parts representing different tribes. The coastal and Chinook Indians are made from the lower body, the Klickitat from the legs, the Yakimas from the monster's ribs, the arms, the Cayuse, the head becomes the Nez Perce, while the hair, blood, and waist become the Snake Indians because of their violent behavior. Each body part symbolizes a unique characteristic or quality of that Indian tribe. Coyote. Coastal Indians have their own legends and stories. Again, Coyote is the focal point. This time, Coyote is with the Clackamas Chinook tribe of Western Oregon. In this legend, Indians are suffering from severe hunger. Coyote helps the Indians trap fish near the Willamette Falls, but he soon becomes angry and forces the Indians to spear the fish rather than trap them. Charger. The Skagits of Western Washington describe the origin of the region's tribes. After the Great Flood, only 5 Indians survived. From 2 survivors, a son was born. This son created many of the tribes by covering the earth with a blanket. Strong winds dispersed the various tribes throughout the region. Some lived near fresh water, some near salt water. Others lived in the forest, while some were on the plains with the buffalo. Because the Indians were in separate areas, they speak different languages. The son in the Skagit legend is called Charger, or New Creator. Uncovering the past. There was no written history describing the Pacific Northwest and its original inhabitants before the first European explorers visited the region. Information about past Indian cultures was somewhat limited to listening to their legends, stories, chants, and songs. Archaeologists and other scientists routinely search the Pacific Northwest landscape looking for any artifact or piece of information that will tell them about the first people, cultures, and other life forms that inhabited the Pacific Northwest. Today, numerous archaeological digs provide some important clues about the past. In the past 4 decades, scholars have constructed some very significant archaeological studies. 5 of the most important archaeological finds in the Pacific Northwest include Marmas Man, Ozit Dig, Manus Mastodon, Ritchie Clovis Cache, and Kennewick Man. Marmas Man. In the 1950s and 60s, Dr. Richard Dougherty, a Washington State University geologist, led an excavation of the Marmas rock shelter on the Palouse River. Human skeletal bones were found near the cave rock shelter. These bone fragments confirm that humans lived in the Pacific Northwest during the final stages of the Ice Age some 11,000 years ago. After many years of careful digging and recording, the Marmas rock shelter was flooded by the reservoir waters of the Lower Monument Dam on the Snake River. Ozit Dig. In 1966, another important archaeological site was developed near Cape Alava on the western side of the Olympic Peninsula. This was the Ozit Dig. Apparently, a Makah village was buried under mud clay about 500 years ago. The deep mudslide covered and preserved more than 50,000 Indian artifacts. These Makah artifacts were uncovered from 1966 to 1981 by an archaeological team, again headed by Dr. Richard Dougherty of Washington State University. These artifacts told a rather complete story about the Makah Indian lifestyle before the first Spaniards explored the Pacific Northwest. Manus Mastodon. The third major archaeological dig site was only a few miles away from the Ozit Dig site. Located on the eastern side of the Olympic Peninsula is the Manus Mastodon site, where bones of a mastodon were discovered on a nearby farm in 1977. The preserved remains of the mastodon had the tip of a man-made weapon embedded into a rib, providing evidence that humans hunted in the Pacific Northwest coastal areas during the final stages of the Ice Age. A Washington State University zoologist, Dr. Carl Gustafson, estimated that this mastodon died about 12,000 years ago. With verification that humans lived in coastal areas of the Pacific some 12,000 years ago, it is logical to ask whether humans were also living in the east of the Cascade Mountains during the same time period. Recent evidence proves this to be true. A human cave site near Eden, Idaho produced artifacts showing human life there about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. Ritchie Clovis Cache. On a bench near the Columbia River in East Wenatchee, Washington, the Ritchie Clovis Cache was discovered in an apple orchard. This particular Clovis cache was found in 1987, and excavation continued until 1990. The archaeological team was directed by Dr. Michael Gramley, Buffalo Museum director, who was a specialist in the study of Clovis Man artifacts. In contrast to the other major archaeological projects, the Ritchie Clovis Cache project was marred by conflict and controversy. Various scientific teams and museums squabbled about aspects of the dig, while the Colville Indians protested about the unearthing of their burial site. Who would possess the artifacts? In 1992, the Washington State Historical Society of Tacoma paid for the rights to the Ritchie Clovis Cache. According to the agreement, no digging would be allowed for 15 years. Artifacts unearthed from this limited dig place humans there about 11,250 years ago. A more thorough dig and future extensive research should provide some additional information. In 2007, the site will be open for further research. Pacific Northwest Indians. During the past 14,000 to 30,000 years ago, Indians migrated through the present Pacific Northwest region of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. The Cascade Mountains divide the region into two distinct environments. One environment is a moist, heavily forested area west of the Cascades. The other is a semi-arid, sparse grassland east of the Cascades. Those Indians living west of the Cascade Mountains belong to the coastal Indian group. Most of the coastal Indians lived in permanent villages along the freshwater and saltwater areas of the region. There were many tribes living within the coastal areas of the Pacific Northwest. Normally, these tribes permanently located in a rather limited geographic area with only a few hundred members. In contrast, living east of the Cascade Mountains were the Plateau Indians. Plateau Indians were nomadic. They moved frequently in search of life's necessities: safety, food, water, and shelter. These families, clans, bands, camps, and tribes often competed over traditional hunting and fishing grounds that provided those basic necessities. Overall, there were fewer plateau tribes than coastal tribes, but each plateau tribe generally had more members. Some of the largest plateau tribes may have had a few thousand members. Plateau people traveled great distances over a large geographic area in a harsher, semi-arid environment. Contrasting cultures. It is important to acknowledge, understand, and appreciate the basic cultural similarities and differences between the Pacific Northwest coastal and plateau Native Americans. The following cultural aspects will be discussed: physical appearance, location, tribal units, tribal structure, communication, clothing, diet, hunting and gathering, whaling, shelter, transportation, economic activities, tools and implements, recreation, ceremonies, religion, potlatch, social organization, and unique customs. Physical appearance. The Pacific Northwest Native Americans' physical characteristics include reddish-brown skin color, straight black hair, dark brown or black eye color, broad forehead, high prominent cheekbones, and little facial and body hair. The coastal Indians had an oval shape. They were generally shorter in stature with a stockier body build. The Plateau Indians were tall, lean, and muscular with an athletic build. They had a thinner, more angular shaped face. Location. The coastal Indians lived west of the Cascade Mountains. The majority of these people lived in numerous permanent villages dotting the tidal coastlands of the Pacific Ocean, Strait of Juan de Fuca, San Juan Islands, and the Puget Sound area. The area's moderate climate and favorable natural environment allowed coastal Indians to live in one area quite comfortably. There were few reasons for venturing from their village unless perhaps to trade with neighboring tribes or to war against their enemies. They also had few reasons to go into the dense forests of the interior. Originally, the coastal Indians lived on the saltwater shorelands, lake shores, or along the banks of many streams and rivers, flowing from the Cascade, Olympic, Coastal, and Siskiyou mountain ranges. Because of the irregularities and indentations of the coastal areas and dense forests, the coastal Indians lived in small, isolated villages. Communication and contact between villages and tribal members were infrequent. The Pacific Northwest Plateau Indians lived in a harsher natural environment. They were located in the interior areas east of the Cascade Mountains and west of the Rocky Mountains. The Plateau Indians were nomadic, moving about in an area with no permanent location. By necessity, the Plateau Indians were constantly on the move, seeking fresh water, food, shelter, and safety. The Plateau Indians generally organized into fewer but larger tribal groups than the coastal Indians. Because the Plateau Indians had to constantly move seeking life's basic needs, conflicts developed when one tribe moved into another tribe's territory. The shape and area of an individual tribe's territory were constantly changing depending upon the size, strength, and aggressiveness of the neighboring tribe. Competition for the best grazing, hunting, and fishing grounds was fierce. Life was a challenge for each Plateau Indian. Their natural environment was very dry throughout the year. It was hotter in the summer, much colder in the winter than the natural environment of the coastal Indian. Food supplies and fresh water were also more scarce for Plateau Indians. Tribal units. The Native Americans traveled and lived throughout the Pacific Northwest. Many different tribes formed, each developing their own characteristics that were similar to, yet different from, neighboring tribes. Tribal groups were very numerous in this region. Among the coastal tribes, the most significant tribes included Clackamas, Clatsop, Coquille, Silts, Tillamook, Tualatin, Umpqua tribes in Oregon, the Chehalis, Chinook, Klallam, Lumi, Maka, Muckleshoot, Nisqually, Nooksack, Puyallup, Salish, and Suquamish tribes in Washington. The most historically significant plateau tribes that lived in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, and Idaho were Bannock, Cayuse, Coeur d'Alene, Colville, Flathead, Klamath, Klickitat, Kunai, Modoc, Molalla, Nez Perce, Northern Paiute, Palouse, Shoshone, Spokane, Umatilla, Walla Walla, Wasco, and Yakima. In addition, there were other smaller coastal and plateau tribes of regional importance. Refer to map 4-1. Tribal structure. The Native Americans living in the Pacific Northwest are organized into groups called tribes. Usually the tribe represented several families, clans, bands, councils, villages, or lodges. Within each village or tribal unit, the leader was called a chief. Usually the next important leader was the village or tribal shaman, a medicine man or spiritual leader. The coastal Indians had a well-defined, and structured class system. An individual's class ranking within the tribe was based upon their social class at birth and or their material wealth of the individual. Because the coastal Indians placed greater emphasis upon material wealth, the wealthiest member of the tribe was usually chosen as the chief. The nobility class was composed of other wealthy individuals and other close relatives of the chief. However, the majority of tribal members were commoners. The lowest ranked members of the class system were the tribe's slaves. Slaves were usually women and children captured as a direct result of intertribal warfare or warfare with the whites. The adult male was usually killed rather than enslaved by the victor. Possession and ownership of slaves were very important. Prestigious objects signified personal and tribal wealth. Tribal chiefs and shamans maintained their leadership positions as long as they had material wealth, spiritual powers, and mutual respect. Loss of any one of these factors could immediately bring disfavor, disgrace, loss of personal power, and influence in the tribe. The tribal shaman took the most risk. If his supernatural and spiritual powers declined, he might be killed by his own tribe. The Plateau Indian tribal structure, and organization were similar to the coastal Indians, although there were some important differences. Individuals showing courage, valor, and bravery were generally respected by their peers. Those with wisdom, good decision skills, were highly honored by the other members of the tribe. The most respected individuals became tribal leaders and chiefs. The most important functions of the tribal chief were his ability to keep peace among members of the tribe, to settle personal quarrels, to decide the guilt or innocence of the accused, to receive guests, to secure adequate food, and provide security for the tribe. In times of war, the chief became a military leader. In other times of crisis, the chief would be the spiritual leader as well. The larger tribes in the interior regions, such as Nez Perce, had several tribal chiefs. Each chief had designated responsibilities of leadership. The Plateau Indians were a more communal social system compared to the highly structured class system of the coastal Indians. The Plateau Indians did not value material goods or even slaves in the same way as the coastal Indian. The Plateau Indians sought the basic necessities of life. This was a community effort. Survival was the first priority to the Plateau Indians. Acquisition of material goods for personal wealth and status meant little to the Plateau people. Communication. Any form of personal and/or group communication was extremely difficult for any Pacific Northwest Indian. None of the early Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest had a written language. There was no uniform or common oral language either. Each tribe usually developed an oral language of its own. Holding a conversation between various tribes was very difficult. Individual tribes communicated their history, legends, and ideas through many forms of personal or collective expression, such as storytelling, songs, chants, dances, totem poles, pattern designs on blankets, and by drawing pictorial symbols on rocks, walls of caves, or animal skins, as well as smoke signals and sign language. The Pacific Northwest Indians had many different spoken languages and various dialects. Coastal Indian languages were generally classified into three general language groups: Nootka, Coastal Salish, and Chinook. Sahapatan, Athabaskan, Chemaquan, and Wakashan were also spoken. The Plateau Indians spoke Interior Salish, Sahapatan, Chinook, Molala Cayuse, and Shoshonean. Overall, there were over 160 different languages spoken by the Pacific Northwest Indians. Obviously, simple oral communication between different Indian tribes was not so easy. The communication barrier was further compounded for the Indians when new non-Native Americans came into the Pacific Northwest after the mid-16th century. How did these very different people communicate with each other? They used sign language and Chinook jargon. Chinook jargon evolved through the Indians' contact with white explorers, fur traders, Christian missionaries, and settlers. Chinook jargon was a mixture of Chinook, English, and French words. Today, English is spoken, but many Indians still speak their ancestral language as well. Clothing. Both Native American groups were skilled in using available raw material to make functional and attractive garments. The use of unique materials and the different styles of clothing showed the coastal Indians' ability to adapt to their natural environment. The summer temperatures of the Pacific Northwest Western region are mild. The coastal Indians wore little clothing. Males wore breech clothing and went barefoot. Sometimes they wore leggings and moccasins. Females wore skirts and dresses. Made from dog hair, grass, cattails, shredded cedar bark, or animal skins. Cedar bark clothing was commonly worn. Due to a cool, rainy climate during the winter months, both male and female coastal Indians wore more protective garments. The coastal Indians rarely used animal skins because leather is not practical in a wet climate. They made capes, ponchos, robes, blankets, and garments from grasses, cedar bark, and dog hair. They also designed and wore conical-shaped hats to help keep them dry. Some even made and wore basket hats made from local reeds. Mats were also made from the same materials as well as from moss and cattails. The Plateau Indians wore decorative clothing made from animal skins, fur pelts, dog hair, and grass. Their clothing reflected the materials available in their environment. Their clothing was very practical. Frequently, they wore accessories such as horns, small furs, headdresses, feathers, bear claws, necklaces, earrings, nose rings, bones, scalps, and very colorful stones, shells, and beads. They also wore hair ornaments made from wood, bone, shells, copper, and other metals. During the dry, hot summer months, the Plateau Indians wore clothing made from very light materials. Males wore skimpy breechcloths, leather moccasins, and leather leggings to protect their legs from thorny plants east of the Cascades. Females wore decorative dresses made from animal skins, woven grass, and/or dog hair. They wore moccasins to protect their feet. In winter, warm, heavy winter garments were made from animal skins and fur pelts, protected the Plateau Indians from snow, long cold spells, and the strong, bitter cold winds. Tough leather moccasins, heavy leggings, and clothing designed to help keep them warm and dry were necessary during the cold winters. They also wrapped woven blankets and fur pelts around themselves to reduce their exposure to the bitter winter cold. Both coastal and plateau Indians designed colorful blankets, beautiful ceremonial clothing, and other ornamental garments. The coastal Indians made uniquely designed ceremonial masks that were often worn at potlatches, burial ceremonies, marriage ceremonies, and other special occasions. Because of the rainy climate, the coastal Indians also made and wore a variety of cone or circular shaped hats. The Plateau Indian made brightly colored feathered headdresses worn at various tribal ceremonies, special celebrations, and during times of war. They also wore a colorful assortment of feathers, bones, beads, jewelry, shells, metallic objects, horns, animal teeth and skins, furs, and stones to enhance their physical appearance. Diet. The Pacific Northwest coastal Indians were excellent fishers, hunters, and food gatherers. They were fortunate to live where food supplies were varied and plentiful. Because of the sufficient food supplies, the coastal Indians lived in permanent villages close to either saltwater or freshwater bodies. The Pacific Ocean and Puget Sound provided the coastal Indian with an adequate supply of the following foods: whale, salmon, otter, seal, razor clams, oyster, smelt, abalone, halibut, cod, other assorted shellfish, and fish. The region's streams and rivers yielded bountiful harvests of salmon, trout, and other freshwater fish. Coastal Indians also hunted and trapped waterfowl and other small birds. The forested areas of western Washington and Oregon provided an excellent habitat for many different kinds of large and small game animals. The coastal Indians also hunted deer, elk, bear, mountain sheep, and mountain goats. To supplement their meat and fish diet, women and children gathered berries and roots. Usually foods such as baked and smoked salmon fillets, steamed clams, cooked meat, and fish were prepared for immediate consumption. The Indians used smoke pits, open pit fires, and hot rocks placed into containers of water to cook their food. They ate the following fresh: roots, nuts, berries, and fruit. To preserve foods, they dried them for future consumption. The coastal Indians made beautiful ladles, containers, bowls, baskets, and eating and cooking utensils from reed, cedar bark, wood, stone, and metal. Hunting and gathering. The Plateau Indians were not so fortunate as the coastal Indians. Food and water were generally scarce and difficult to find. Frequently throughout their history, the various Plateau tribes found themselves competing for the same food sources in the most favorable fishing and hunting areas. Because of the inadequate food and water supplies in any given area at any given time, the Plateau Indians were nomadic. Moving from place to place, they sought adequate food and water for their families and livestock. Living between the Cascade and Rocky Mountains, all Plateau Indians had a harsh lifestyle. Control of those places where life's necessity existed was fiercely competitive. The Plateau Indians were nomadic by necessity, not by choice. They would hunt deer, antelope, bear, elk, buffalo, game birds, waterfowl, rabbits, mountain goat, bighorn sheep, beaver, grouse, groundhogs, and prairie dogs, and other meat sources. When food was scarce, they ate dog, horse, snakes, grasshoppers, crickets, and other insects. All these were found in the most in the areas of the Columbia Plateau region except for buffalo. Usually hunting parties had to cross the Rocky Mountains to the Great Plains to hunt buffalo. This was a very arduous and dangerous venture for the Plateau Indian hunters. Plateau Indians were also food gatherers. They picked wild berries such as blackberries, huckleberries, chokeberries, and service berries. They collected nuts and seeds, especially the sunflower seed. They dug camas bulbs and bitter roots that were cooked in earthen ovens, mashed, boiled, and then dried into flat cakes. Biscuit roots were cooked and dried into square cakes, while bitter roots were peeled and boiled before eaten. The Plateau Indians also made pemmican from processed animal fat, berries, camas root, and fish. Pemmican was baked, boiled, or eaten raw. Salmon was also a very important food for the Plateau Indian, as well as the coastal Indian. Salmon was abundant in most rivers and streams during the spawning season when salmon migrated upstream. The salmon, driven by instinct, were easy to catch. The salmon struggled against the swift current of mountain streams and rivers in their quest to reach their spawning grounds. Major natural barriers, such as rapids, cataracts, and waterfalls, were difficult obstacles to physically overcome. These fishing grounds were also attractive to bear. Bears had the same ease of capturing dying salmon as the Indians. 3 of the Plateau Indians' favored salmon fishing sites were Willamette Falls, Kettle Falls, and Celio Falls. Kettle and Celio Falls were magnificent fishing spots until they were permanently flooded by the rising reservoir waters behind Grand Coulee and the Dalles dams in the mid-20th century. Whaling. Perhaps the most exciting and dangerous activity associated with food gathering was the whale hunt. Whales migrate annually along the British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon coastlines. A few coastal tribes, the Clamas, Macaws, Queets, Quinaults, were the primary whale hunters. However, the tribe most respected for their personal courage and their whaling skill was the Makah. Washington Makah Native Americans lived along the extreme northwest coastline of the Olympic Peninsula near present-day Nia Bay. Makahs observed ocean waters from either high vistas or canoes. They looked for pods of migrating whales. Once a pod was spotted, the men of the village paddled their large whaling dugout canoes towards the pod. When an intended whale was selected, the men paddled hard so a harpooner could get a good shot at the whale. The hunters would approach the whale on its left side. Next, the harpooner threw his 20-foot harpoon. Hopefully, this harpoon stuck just behind the left fin of the whale. The sinewy rope was connected to the bow of the canoe and inflated inflated seal floats were used to exhaust the harpooned whale. The stricken whale would dive deep into the ocean and eventually it would leap from the water, attempting to overturn or smash the 40 to 65-foot whaling canoe with its massive tail. Many courageous Indian whalers met death prematurely. Usually after a long struggle lasting many hours or even a few days, the harpooned whale slowly died. Sewing the whale's mouth shut, plugging the blowhole with blubber, using sealskin floats that helped the Indians prevent the whale from sinking. The victorious whalers towed the dead whale to their village with the help of the incoming tide. All members of the tribe were greeted the successful whalers. This was a time for celebration, feasting, and thanksgiving. Almost every portion of the whale was used by the tribe. The most prized portions were given to the harpooners and those tribal members of status. Whale blubber, oil, meat, and other body parts were distributed among the remaining villagers according to their class and tribal rank. Shelter. Most coastal Indians lived in large permanent cedar log or plank structure called a longhouse or a plank house. Longhouses were 40 to 100 feet long. Several related families lived in one longhouse. The structure had a shed-like roof, no windows, a few doors, and a narrow opening at the ceiling for venting the campfire smoke. Other types of shelters the coastal Indians used were small A-frame houses, shed-like structures, and very small temporary wood frame shelters that were covered by cattail materials or woven mats. The Plateau Indians seldom used permanent shelters. Nomadic people who must move frequently require a form of shelter that is quick and easy to put up and take down. The vast majority of Plateau Indians lived in teepees or teepees. The teepee was a cone frame shelter of several long poles covered by woven mats or hides of animals. Some Shoshone Indians made grass-covered houses to live in during the hot summers. During the cold winters, Plateau Indians sought refuge from the snow and extreme winds by living in caves or constructing a pit house. A pit house is usually 5 to 6 feet deep and perhaps 30 feet in diameter. The framework above the pit house was covered with animal skins, hides, and earthen materials that helped protect the occupants. Normally, the pit house was constructed on the leeward slope of hills away from the penetrating winter winds. The number of houses, teepees, or lodges was a good indicator of the village or band size. Transportation. The Indians' primary means of transportation, walking, was very slow and quite limiting. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Pacific Northwest Indians primarily traveled on foot or by dugout canoe. Indians living in the Pacific Northwest never used sails or the wheel. It wasn't until about 1730 AD that another form of transportation was used by Pacific Northwest Indians when Spaniards introduced horses to the Shoshone tribe of the Plateau Indians. Canoe. Even though coastal Indians walked and on occasion used horses, their primary means of travel was the dugout canoe. The coastal Indians were excellent canoe builders. The process of constructing a dugout canoe was rather simple, but required hard work, craftsmanship, and a few months' time. To begin, the Indians selected a tall cedar tree, cut it to the desired length, took off the bark, dug out the wood inside the canoe with an adze and/or axe, burned the inside, filled it with water, heated the water with hot rocks, heated the outside with bark fires, separated or stretched the interior area, braced the separated edges, smoothed the bottom, applied decorative paint, and carved the bow of the dugout canoe. Dugout canoes were made to transport people, to haul trading goods and supplies, to go fishing and whaling, and to wage war. Dugout canoes came in all sizes. However, the largest may have been over 30 feet in length. Whaling and war canoes were elaborately decorated and skillfully designed. Horse. Before the arrival of the horse in the early 18th century, the Plateau Indians relied on walking and running to travel, hunt, and gather food. The horse greatly increased the mobility of these nomadic Indians. A horse or pony became the most prized and important possession of the Plateau Indian. Some Plateau tribes, such as the Shoshone, Nez Perce, Klickitat, Cayuse, were respected for their horsemanship. The Plateau Indians often captured and broke wild horses. But frequently they increased their own herds by trading, exchanging, breeding, receiving as gifts, and stealing from other Indians or settlers. The number of horses owned was an accurate measure of wealth for either an individual or tribe. The Appaloosa breed of horse was developed by the Nez Perce Indian tribe. Today, the Appaloosa is one of the most popular breeds. Travois. Horses and sometimes dogs were used to haul the Plateau Indians' possessions. The horse or dog would drag a travois. Travois consisted of two long poles of unequal length. The poles were attached to the shoulders of the animal by leather straps. A woven mat and/or animal hides covered the space between the poles behind the animal. The travois poles, being of different lengths, help reduce the bounce and maintain balance for a smoother ride when pulled across rough ground. Most of the Indians' possessions were transported by the travois, as well as the ill, wounded, elderly, or very young children. Economic activities. The Pacific Northwest Indians' economic activities included hunting, fishing, food gathering, and making the necessities of life. The men of the tribe performed three basic roles of hunter, fisher, and warrior. The women raised the children, gathered the berries, nuts, and roots, prepared the meals, made the clothing and utensils, and did other everyday tasks which men would not do. Life was harsh and nothing was easy. Survival was a day-to-day challenge. Both the coastal and plateau Indians loved to negotiate and barter. They were very experienced and skilled traders. The major economic activity of the coastal Indians included food gathering, hunting, fishing, and whaling. In addition, they also made dugout canoes, totem poles, ceremonial masks, tools, utensils, household furnishings, clothing, weapons, and shelters such as longhouses or plank houses. The lifestyle of the coastal Indian was much easier and more stable than that of the plateau Indians who lived in the region's interior. The economic activities of the Plateau Indians were similar to those of their coastal neighbors, yet there were some major differences as well. Plateau Indians were more skilled in animal husbandry and horsemanship. However, their canoe building was not as skilled or as elaborate as the coastal Indians. Woodworking, wood carving, and seashell crafts were less important to the Plateau Indian, but their beadwork and leather goods were more intricate than those made by the coastal tribes. Great effort was made by both coastal and plateau people to adapt themselves successfully to their respective environments. Each faced survival under demanding natural conditions. Tools and implements. The Native Americans' tools and implements were primitive. The coastal Indians did not use metal tools until after the arrival of the Europeans. Instead, they used materials such as horns, animal bone, animal hair, wood, rock, grasses, shells to create woven baskets, blankets, adze, hammers, chisels, knives, fish hooks, harpoons, spears, clubs, bows and arrows, spoons and ladles, storage boxes, and the like. The Plateau Indians used many of the same objects and materials. Recreation. The Pacific Northwest Native Americans participated in a variety of recreational and athletic activities. Many of the recreational activities provided opportunities for individuals to express their bravery and athletic skills while competing against one another. Activities included canoe racing, foot races, tug of war, wrestling, bow and arrow contests, spear throwing, horsemanship, and gambling. Gambling was a favorite social, recreational, and economic activity. There were all sorts of gambling games and contests, such as the very popular stick and bone games. Ceremonies. Each tribe had different ceremonies for events such as puberty, marriage, and burials. Usually upon reaching puberty, a youth was sent into the wilderness alone to seek a rendezvous or meeting with the spirits. This was called a spirit dance. Usually boys around 15 would fast during January. This rite of passage experience had an important impact on the individual, often determining their role in life. Marriage ceremonies varied greatly. In some tribes, a young couple simply received permission to share the same shelter. In other tribes, especially the coastal tribes, there was an elaborate potlatch ceremony for the couple. It was common for a girl of the coastal Indians to seek marriage to a male of greater wealth or social status than her own family. Religion. The Pacific Northwest Native Americans' religion was based primarily upon an individual's personal beliefs and spiritual experiences. The basic religion was animism. Animism was based upon the direct relationship between the individual and his or her spirit. Good and evil spirits were possessed by objects such as the sun, moon, stars, trees, water, and animals. Animism was a powerful experience. Each individual had a spiritual experience that had a lasting effect on his or her life. In contrast, the various Christian religions were oriented toward the group and based on more abstract ideas and teachings of the church. The shaman. The most powerful person spiritually within the tribe was the shaman or medicine man. Each shaman was personally responsible for the secrecy of tribal customs, the use of herbs to heal the ill. The shaman performed healing ceremonies for the ill. Being a shaman had advantages as well as obvious disadvantages. Tribal customs frequently placed the responsibility for an ill or injured person's death directly upon the shaman. If a patient died, members of the tribe, village, or family might seek revenge by taking the life of the shaman. Although the shaman was spiritually powerful, he relied heavily upon his own magical, mystical, and supernatural abilities to retain those special powers. He was the spiritual leader of the tribe. Burial rites. Life was difficult and hazardous for the early residents of the Pacific Northwest, Native Americans and settlers alike. Death frequently came to the very young as well as the very old. With the influx of new people, Native Americans were exposed to many diseases such as smallpox, chickenpox, cholera, and measles. These diseases ravaged Native Americans because they had no natural immunities. As a result, the Indians' life expectancy sharply declined with the arrival of the settlers. For many years, the Native American population dramatically declined. A tribal member's death was honored with a burial ceremony. Sometimes the dead person's horse, or perhaps a slave, was killed and buried with the deceased. The possession and the body were taken to the tribe's secret and sacred burial grounds. Some tribes buried the body in the ground, while other tribes placed the body on a platform above the ground or in a tree. This action was done out of concern that the wild animals might disturb the body. During warfare, every effort was made to remove the dead from the battlefield so that they may be honored with a proper burial. The potlatch. A unique ceremony practiced by the coastal Indians of the Pacific Northwest was the potlatch. The potlatch was a Chinook jargon word meaning to give. A potlatch was a fairly common tribal ceremony in which either tribe or chief hosted a tremendous party. They showered guests with lavish gifts. The object was to show generosity towards the guest as well as exhibit the wealth of the host. Each host sought to give away more of his wealth than the previous potlatch host. Gifts were given to thank guests for coming. Some individuals would destroy their own property, such as burning down their longhouse or sinking a canoe. Sometimes a slave was killed to impress the guests. Any number of events resulted in a potlatch: marriage, funerals, the coming of age by prominent youth of the family, village, tribe, or the completion of a new longhouse. A potlatch was a great social event where both guests and hosts enjoyed themselves during the festivities. Social organization. The family was composed by parents, children, and other close relatives. Family members shared food, transportation, and shelter. The male was dominant while the female was rather subservient to the male. The male was the provider and protector of the family and the tribe. His responsibilities included hunting, fishing, conducting a formal business, the formal business of the tribe and family, and was a warrior in battle. The women handled the day-to-day household routine and cared for the children. They dug roots, gathered berries, made clothing, and prepared meals. Women generally respected the position and power of their male counterparts. Today, the female is gaining equality with the Native American male, just as it is in modern society as a whole. The Native American youth respected their elders. Children were shown much love and care by their parents. Guidance was in the form of praise for good behavior and ridicule for bad behavior. Indian parents sometimes threatened their children with evil spirits, but seldom physically punished them. The coastal Indians controlled the development of their children. The Plateau Indians allowed their children much more independence. And that is the end of the chapter.